الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So today inshallah we're going to try to wrap up the remainder of the book. There's 3-4 chapters. We're going to be covering the basic themes of the remainder of the chapters, God willing, inshallah. Now the first half of the book talks about what was before Islam, what happened with the coming of Islam, what it changed, and how it rose, and why it rose. So all of these things we've discussed. Now we're going to be talking about the decline of Islam, and then how it will rise again, inshallah. And we're going to stop with that, bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. So we're going to be touching on some basic points, bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Now, when it comes to the downfall, number one, this is an imaging, right? This is a way of looking at things. I don't necessarily agree with how the author presents it as the downfall, per se, because, number one, that's to think of history in only a linear form. So it comes back to your vision of history. If you think history is simply linear, like it's just progressing one way, then naturally you're going to think like that. If you believe that it has both elements, it's linear as in it's progressing a certain manner, and at the same time there are these eternal loops, these cycles that are occurring, which are the sunan of Allah, the ways of God, the natural ways that Allah has bestowed upon the world, then you'll know that there's always cycles. There's rises, and there's falls, and there's rises again. As Allah says, وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. These are but days that we give and take between people. We exchange among nations and civilizations. So downfall might be a bit of a way of looking at it as if, okay, it's just constantly been on a decline. Naturally, there is that element as well, which is, the Prophet ﷺ saying that the best of nations is my generation, the one after them, and the one after them. And then each generation after that, naturally, what does that mean? It'll be further and further away from being the best. And we know that, the Day of Judgment will only come, or, Imam Mahdi will only come until people will reach a certain level. So there is this natural decline. But at the same time, the Prophet ﷺ says that in each generation, Allah will send a reviver who will revive the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, right? In each century, in each generation. And so you have both concepts of moral progress, which is complete with the coming of the Prophet ﷺ, but it's renewal occurring through the generations. And at the same time, this natural moving away from the light of prophethood, which was of revelation, till the end of days when things will come back, and then Day of Judgment after that. So both are falling out. So one can say that the way it's painted as the downfall is partially incorrect, because it's not necessarily a downfall, because there was times of revival and then there was times of coming down, and this has happened throughout history. So it's not this like constant going down and it'll never come back up. That's not how it works. Anyways, so now we can say quite confidently that the most morally and politically and economically stable and ideal times was the time of the caliphate of the Khulafa al-Rashidun, and this was the peak of it, right? Why is this the situation? We've mentioned this before, because the stature of the caliphate, the positioning of the khilafah, is not simply just a political institution. It's not simply just, okay, well, they're here to make sure that politics are running, economy is running, and that's it. But no, they are literally stewards of the rule of God. They are stewards to the rule of God. And that's why it's not a monarchy, because they can't claim sovereignty. Sovereignty, true power, true independent power, is only God's. Even the Prophet ﷺ, with all his stature and all his virtue, was merely a human and a messenger of God. He did not have rule. He did not have true say. It was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who did. So the Khilafah was inheriting this position of ruling over the worldly and the hereafterly affairs of the people, of the world. This was the status of the caliphate. Right? So it's their job to keep moral uprightness within the world, as well as economic and political. This is what we know as jihad. Right? So it's the self-preserving and prevailing mechanisms of Islam that constitute jihad, spiritually, familially, governmentally, and so on and so forth. Right? It's at every level that this occurs. This is how we understand our understanding of jihad. Okay? Now, the other side to the caliph was that he was a mujtahid. So there's jihad, then there's ijtihad. There's both pieces, jihad and ijtihad. Ijtihad is where the individual is at the peak of scholarship. So the knowledge that they're providing is directly accessing all the knowledge that is presented in front of them from the Quran and Sunnah, from the opinions of the scholars, and then they look at a new situation and they, in light of all this knowledge, will then dictate that this should be this way, according to the rules and the understandings of the Quran and Sunnah. This is ijtihad. Okay? Now, a khalifa is one who does both. That is what a khalifa is. This is the ideal of the khalifa. This is why Abu Bakr is the best of the companions. And he's the best caliph. And that's why he was first. And then you have Umar, second best of the companions. And that's why he's the second caliph. And he's the most knowledgeable of them as a mujtahid. Then you have Uthman, then you have Ali, radiallahu ta'ala anhum ajma'in. Right? So this position is to take care of the worldly and the non-worldly affairs of the people. It's not just one. Right? That's what a caliph is supposed to do. And this is what, in the previous class we discussed, what made Islam so unique in giving it its rise morally among the world. This is why the light of Allah spread only through His final religion of Islam. This is why Allah was only pleased with Islam as being the religion for mankind, and no other religion. Right? Because the deen and dunya are coming together in the understanding of Islam. All right. Now, the moment the caliphate turned into imperialism, the moment it fell into empire and into monarchy, this is when things started to change. This is when the detachment of the political from the sociological and the religious started to occur. Okay? This is when you have siyasa as a separate domain, politics as a separate domain from the religious domain. Of course, it's still part of the Sharia. Of course, the Sharia is the highest. Of course, the word of Allah is the highest. But yet, the scholars were given a separate domain from the domain of leadership and from the domain of politics. And so the ijtihad that was supposed to occur within the political domain was severed. And this is why from earlier on you see the earlier ulama also mentioning that there is the domain of the ruler who does politics. So of course he has rules that he needs to follow, but then the rest of it is politics. This, in many ways, what this means is that there was a lot that needed to be done within this domain that was left out. And the reason for this is because of this separation, because we didn't have a true Khalifa after that. Except for the exception of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, rahimahullah ta'ala. Even the Umayyads, even the Abbasids, we didn't have a true caliph in the sense who was a scholar and leader who was equipped to do ijtihad within the jihad. That did not occur, right? And that is something that found this not being able to revitalize the political in light of the shara'i. Right? Of course, there was work after that, but not in its ideal sense. Not in the sense of the khilafah, in its purest form. You don't have that. You have, broken images. You have scholars in supporting roles to the leader, to the ruler, but you don't have that perfect vision anymore, right? And that's why the Prophet ﷺ said that the Khilafah will be for 40 years after me. Will be for 40 years after me. And that's what happened. The Khilafah lasted for 40 years after the Prophet ﷺ. Okay? After that, you do see this decline because of this separation that we're talking about, right? So a lot of the rulers became more involved in not the moral improvement of the people, but rather in terms of their rulership and power. So you see that power becomes more important than the moral behavior of the world. And that's when you see this disconnect occurring. Because ijtihad and jihad are for the moral health and well-being of the world and humanity. When you see that disconnect, you see that people wanted power for its own sake. They wanted power without the moral landscape, but they still could not disconnect from it because it was still impossible to do so because the Sharia was still high. It was still the highest. Okay. Now we move on. So none of the Umayyads or the Abbasid caliphs, except Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, rahimahullah, came fully up to the standard of Islam as a caliph. Right? We agree on this. The history agrees on this. With the succession of weak caliphs, there soon occurred a rift between the church and state in the religio-political order of Islam. Now, again, this framing is very problematic because we've already mentioned how modernity, this is the modernistic way of looking at the world, where there's a church and then there's the state. In Islam, we never had that. We had no church. We had no body that tells you what is and what isn't. That's it. We have madahib of fiqh. Okay. Then we have scholars discussing aqidah. Okay. You have all of this occurring. We never had a church. Okay. So this idea of church and state is problematic, and maybe the translator wasn't aware of what the Shaykh was trying to say when he translated it this way. Anyways, however, the basic values of religion remained intact and free from distortion. So as in the Sharia still remained. You couldn't distort the Sharia. You can't buy off the entire class of scholarship. That's not possible. Because the scholarship are not, first of all, they're not on your payrolls, traditionally speaking. They're not on the payroll of the caliph. They're not coming from a noble class. They're not the elite. In fact, they're the most poorest of people. They are from the people. And they have risen from them, representing them. Okay? And they couldn't be swayed. This is why, what do all of the books of aqidah, all of the books of fiqh say? What does a scholar do? The scholar stays away from the ruler. So in many ways, they removed themselves from the political to preserve the shari. Okay? In many ways, the ulama, they removed themselves from the political to preserve the shari so that it did not get influenced by political power. Right? Because the only time we've ever had an inquisition is at the early times of the Mu'tazila, when the Mu'tazila said that the Quran is created. And Imam Ahmad rahimahullah rose against them and challenged them. Right? That was the only time we had a pure inquisition on belief. Outside of that, we've never had it because it was a hands-off policy. Yes, you have, you have people, you have trials happening after that, you have things, but never at a policy state level again. This never occurred again. And the reason for this is because you can't mess with the scholars. This became very clear. The people respect and listen to the scholars more than they ever will to the leader. Because they know that Allah's rule, which is what the ruler is supposed to do, the ruler is supposed to only say what Allah says. He's only supposed to command what Allah commands. He's only supposed to forbid what Allah forbids. If he says anything else, you don't need to listen to him. People deeply understand this. People know their religious rights. Right? They know their religious rights. And so what happens? They obviously were more respectful and understanding and caring towards the scholars. This is why, the kings gatherings had barely anything in comparison to the gatherings of the scholars. Imam Ahmed in the Grand Masjid of Baghdad would have more than 5,000 people every single day in his masjid just to listen to him. 5,000 people. Not even a percentage of that would go to the caliph. Not even a percentage of that. So you see that this was there definitely. Okay. So now let's take a few examples of when Islamic demise occurred. When our civilization had a huge strike to its existence, such as the Crusades. The Crusades from the Western Empire caused deep, violent genocides within the Muslim world. So if you notice, genocide is a very Western thing. It's generally a very Western phenomena. Like genocide is something that's deeply built into them, especially on basis of ethnicity and religion. Right? You do not find this in Islam much at all, actually. You won't find people just because simply they're Christian or just because simply they're another group that they will be ethnically cleansed. You don't. This is absurd within Islamic rule, right? It doesn't occur. So the Crusades is a good situation within where we see Islamic demise occur. However, the situation was quickly changed within 100 years. The European attack was overtaken. It started by who did it start by? Nuruddin al-Zenki. Nuruddin al-Zenki was the first to start to solidify the Muslims. Because remember, the Seljuks came. So the Umayyads lasted less than 100 years, around less than 100 years. The Abbasids came. They were at the top of their power for 200 to 300 years. By the 400th year, they were in decline. Then the Seljuks came and they kind of conquered. And the Abbasid Caliph was just only a figurehead. He was just a figurehead. And he called the Seljuks in. He welcomed them in. Why? Because the Bayuds, the Bayyids and the Bayuds, they were Shia, they were Rafida, and they were controlling Baghdad. Right? So they were using the Caliph as a puppet. So he welcomed the Seljuks, who were Sunni, Turks, who had accepted Islam, to come and take the land. Okay? And then after that, what happened? The Christians from Western Europe, they came and they did their holy war, and they did their crusades, and they took the Muslim lands of the Holy Lands. Okay? They took a good portion of parts of Syria, Jordan, and Palestine, okay, which was known as Asham, the Levant. Right? Nuruddin al-Zenki was the first to regather people and start to fight off the Crusaders. And then it was Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, who was a general in his ranks, who took this mission on after him and solidified the rule of the Muslims, and they were kicked out from the entirety of the Holy Lands except for a small slither at the top, where they remained for the next 100 years or so afterwards, right? But their power had been broken. They had no backing anymore. Okay. Let's take another example, which is the Tatar invasion, the invasion of the Mongols. The Tatars made their entry into the capital of Baghdad in 650 and turned it into a massive rubble, right? The Tatars were defeated afterwards by the Egyptian Sultan Saifuddin Qutuz and his successor Baybars. Okay, so even at this point, okay, after the Crusades, it was only about 100 years, not even, and the Mongols, we've discussed this in previous classes. They decimated the Muslim population. They were the first ones to make mountains out of corpses of children, right? It was very, very bleak for the entire world, and especially in the Muslim memory, it's seen as if not the most darkest time in our history, right? Up till today, we don't know where certain areas are because they destroyed them. Like we don't know where certain cities that used to be centers of knowledge, of civilization, millions living there, millions. We don't even know where they are anymore because they absolutely just destroyed them, devastated them. Right, within Iran in the eastern part of the Muslim world. Okay, now but then when they managed to get to Egypt, who was there standing? Who gathered the Muslims again when people were little city-states? People were city-states. Many of them submitting to the Mongols. Who was it? It was Saifuddin Qutuz, who rose from the ranks of who? Which dynasty? Which dynasty? Huh? Of Egypt. Guys. The Mamalik, the Mamluk dynasty, right? It was the Mamluks who then gathered the people. They said, listen, put your differences aside. We need to defeat them. If they manage to get to Egypt, there will be no place of the Islamic world left. This is the last frontier of the Muslim world. The most eastern part of the Islamic civilization, its hub was Egypt. If Egypt is taken, nothing will be left. They took the entirety of Iran. They sacked Baghdad. They made the rivers flow dark of blood and ink for weeks. And after that, they took the entirety of the Levant, of Syria and onwards. The last place left is Egypt. If Egypt falls, there will be no place left that is not under Mongol direct rule. Okay? So they put everybody together. It's phenomenal to have a read of, to see how he did it, how he managed to put people together to fight against the Mongols. They fought right after the battle. He was killed by his general, Baybars, but Baybars also continued the struggle against them, and he had a longer tenure, and he then managed to solidify the rule of Egypt in the Mamluk dynasty of Egypt. Okay? Now, after that, look, the Mamluk started to weaken after that by a few hundred years. And there was no Islamic power. Everybody was weak. There was no united empire. There was no united front anymore. You had little bits and pieces everywhere again. And what happened? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the Ottomans in the 15th century. Okay? He sends the Ottomans in the 15th century, which is 9th century after Hijrah. And they started to conquer Western lands. Lands that had never been conquered. Into Europe, right? And then they slowly conquered, and we know that Muhammad al-Fatih, rahimahullah, in 1455 conquered the capital of the world, Constantinople. He conquered Rome itself, right? And then the Ottoman Empire became the new Roman Empire of the world as an Islamic Roman Empire, right? And throughout this time, last class, we also discussed how Europe's scientific and industrial progress is one of the factors as to why they, went up and why we kind of went down, which I think we'll discuss more later onwards, but we've already touched on this in previous classes. All right. Now, how does chapter 5 look? The rise of the West and its consequences within the world. All right. So you have to understand that one of the this is something that's still debated up till today. Why did the Western world take on such a fanatical relationship with experimental progress? Okay, experimental progress, scientific experimentation. There's a lot to be said. This is like within the field of science and religion, the historical relationship, right? Some say that it has to do with the Protestant, the split within the church. So when the Protestants split from the church, from the Catholic Church, why did they split? They had a fundamental difference. They said, leave tradition behind, read text apparently, only, that's it. You're not going to do anything else but read text. Apparently, we don't need tradition. We don't need a church to tell us what the Bible means. We know what the Bible means. We don't need a church to tell us anything. Okay? This was the Lutheran way in the way of most of the Protestant churches. So some say that because of this apparent reading, this allowed them to start looking at things differently. This is a weak reading, to be honest, because again, even in the Islamic world, we already had people doing this. We had people starting to do this. This was quite well known. There are other factors that I don't think we have time to get into, but they are addressed by a number of scholarships, such as within the Western Academy, you have people like Wa'il Hallaq, who wrote the book The Impossible State. In the second part of his book, he discusses in detail as to why Western civilization was able to rise to what it did in comparison to Islam, because there was more checks and balances as to what just moral expansion looks like. Another reading of this is the fundamental reason for the rise of the West is that it rose from colonialism, right? And this is a primary reason for why they were able to gather so much material at such a rapid rate, and then at the same time why they were able to do what they did, right? So again, these are factors. If you add them all up, then you see what happened, right? Anyways, so Western civilization is not a recent phenomena. Its roots do go back for thousands of years to ancient Greece or Rome. This type of reading, by the way, is also incorrect, right? This type of reading that Western civilization goes back to the ancient Greece and Rome, this is as if to say nothing happened in between. Right? This is as if to say nobody was passed on the torch of civilization. It clearly did, and it went to the Muslims. Right? It clearly did, and it went to the Muslims. Right? So this idea of it being a purely Roman idea is not true. That's number one. Number two, it really overlooks the entire history of the Christian world itself. It just overlooks it, and it says that had nothing to do with it. Right? When, history is born from a context. Ideas are born from a situation. They just don't pop out of nowhere, right? So this idea of painting it as if it goes back to the Greeks and the Romans. First of all, where did the Greeks get it? The Greeks got it from the east. The Greeks got it from Egypt, and they got it from Mesopotamia, which is all Eastern. This is why they call it Middle East or the Near East. Why do they call it that? Because it's tough to kind of deny how they're part of civilization. So you know what? Let's call them the Middle East. And everybody else, well, they're far East. They're Oriental. They're Oriental because we have to kind of situate ourselves towards them because they're that far off. Well, you guys are the cradle of civilization. Europe itself comes from the Middle East. All civilization comes from the Middle East. This is proven fact. There's no disagreement on this. Right? Anyways, so Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, and the paganization of Christianity occurred. We've discussed this before in quite a lot of detail. It says, so just a quick word on the Greeks then. The Greeks disregarded transcendental truths. They had no care for what is sahih, what is not. It's all about feels. I feel good about something, and this is well-to-do. This is how they created their gods as well. Their gods are effectively just ideas of human beings and their own desires. So they created stories of their gods according to their image of what is desired. Right? So that's part of it. The Romans, their primary reason to being uplifted was their military success. Right? Again, they really didn't have any moral enthusiasm. Right? It was just a formula for military success, right, and rule, which is what happens a lot of the times. Like, moving on, we've discussed this as well, the struggle between the church and the state and the misuse of power by the church. We've discussed this in quite a bit of detail already. I don't know if you guys have any questions about this. You can let me know. Any questions? I think we've discussed this in quite a bit of detail already. The Enlightenment and the Darwinian theory of evolution. We've also discussed this quite a lot. I guess we can touch on it again. Now, to briefly put it, I guess, since we've already covered it, is the Enlightenment works with a divorce of morality from knowledge. So morality becomes something separate, knowledge becomes something separate. You start to see the world in a more secular manner that has less to do with the principles of the world, such as is the world necessary? If it is necessary, is it not necessary? Okay. If it's not necessary, then who created it? What is necessary? And the answer has always been God is necessary, right? So it says, listen, put away all of that. Look at things from a materialistic, from a physicalistic standpoint, and then from there move onwards. So the theory of evolution, or specifically the Darwinian theory of evolution, is what put religion to sleep within Europe. Because before this, you had thinkers who were deists, some of them even atheists, but it never reached this level as a culture until the Darwinian theory of evolution. Now, mind you, there had always been theories of evolution before this as well. You know, even Darwin's grandfather had a theory of evolution. Those are not new. None of that is new. It was Darwinian evolution that particularly changed the game in the way people wanted to. People need answers for the world. So what Darwinian evolution did was it said, okay, hold on. All life comes from the origin. So the origin of life, that's one piece. So everything kind of goes back to one, and we all just kind of come from there. There's nothing special about creation. There's nothing special about human beings. And the other part is, selection of the fittest. So the only way people seem to prosper is when, or creatures seem to prosper, not even creatures, but just biological life seems to prosper, is when they can survive, and then they are chosen through that process of selection of survival, and that's how they evolve. That's how they evolve. So these are the two fundamental pillars of Darwinian evolution, which effectively is enclosing all reasoning, all causal properties within the material world. Right? What that does is it says there is no creation, effectively. So it's shutting off the door of any ultimate causation. There is no ultimate cause. There is no ultimate creator. And it's saying there's nothing special about particular creations. There's nothing special about human beings. We weren't created for a reason. So it kind of cuts that off completely. Right? And that's how it's been used up till today. That's how it's being used up till today. All right. Another part that we've also discussed is the growth of nationalism. Right? Before the Enlightenment, yes, you had an idea of being a Frank, of being a Brit, but they weren't cooker-cut like ideas. You had the French ruling over the Brits for the longest time. Even today, the monarchy is more German and French than it is English. Okay, this idea of borders and nationalities based on ethnicity is a very recent 19th century understanding. It didn't exist before this. Right? This is exactly why when the Ottoman Empire began to crash, when it started to be called the sick man of Europe, there was a big crisis of identity because the Ottomans were always just that. They were just Ottomans. They were an Islamic empire. That's what they were. All of a sudden now, you have people saying things like, I'm a Greek, you're a Turk, you're a Hungarian. They need to define these things. They need to define what this means. Because, look, if we speak the same language, then we're ethnically the same. And we deserve to be separate and think of ourselves separate than other people. Right? And then, nationalism is intertwined with the modern nation state. Nation state is literally part of nationalism. Right? And we've discussed this, I think, in a good amount of detail before, so I don't think we'll be able to get into this, but we said that this was a European project that was expanded into the world. These were their ideas that took hold, that they would self-educate into people and say, look, this is the right way of governing yourself. This is the right way of looking at the world. Right? When none of these things existed outside. Nobody had, just because you think this is your solution from your unique problems doesn't mean that this is a solution for other people's issues. Right? And so this is where nationalism started to grow, which created the nation state. Okay? And they're all intertwined. Again, I would suggest doing The Impossible State, definitely having a read of that if you haven't already. Imam Tom on Blogging Theology actually has a splendid series of 4 parts on the impossible state. I would highly, highly recommend you guys listen to that, inshallah, and give it a listen, inshallah. All right. Moving on to the last chapter. Is this the last chapter or there's more? There's more? All right. What did we really lose? We lost the sense of the self. We became secular. That's what we lost. We see the world in a secular manner. We cannot help but think in a secular way. There is no such thing as higher purpose. Everybody is purposeless. Everybody is without meaning, and you find your own. It's all just plain old world, material, economy. That's all there is. There's nothing more to it. And so, yes, you have religion, but that's good for your attire, for your identity. Other than that, there's no space for it in the world. It's morality has no say with grounded principle, because grounded principle does not exist. The only thing that is grounded is the secular material. That's all. Nothing else has any space in the world. So what does that do? It makes you lose your identity of self. It makes you lose how to do politics. It also makes you lose what it means to be human. All the issues that we discussed early on in a worldview and the effects that occur. So with Western domination, it was only the Western worldview that came out on top, and they changed the world. They changed the way people do everything. This is the fundamental difference between traditional imperialism and empire and in between colonialism. Colonialism comes and it changes the way the individuals see themselves. They change individuals to change societies, to change the world for their own benefit. While particularly Islamic conquest has always been about giving people their space underneath the dominion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the fundamental difference. And so this is why up till today you have Zoroastrians who are in such small numbers, but they still survive in Muslim lands. You don't hear about them, but they've survived. Thousands of years they've survived. If Islam was colonial, there would be no Hinduism left in the world. We ruled the subcontinent for 1,000 years. There would be no Hindu left if we were colonial. There would be no Christians or Jews left in the entirety of the Middle East when there's so many of them. There would be no Christians in Eastern Europe. Because Eastern Europe, Greece was under Islamic rule for more than 500 years. 500 years. Greece was Ottoman. There would be no Christians in Greece. There would have been an ethnic cleansing. If Islam was colonial, the way the West is. Right? All right, so anyway, this is what the world lost with the rise of the West. It lost what it meant to be human. We don't know what it means to be human anymore. That's why we don't know what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. We don't know what these things mean. We just have weird culture wars. We have culture wars about everything. Right? And the reason for that is because we lost what it meant to be human a long time ago. Right. All right. Chapter 7. The revival of the Muslim world. I don't know if I have any notes here. Do I have notes here for this? All right. So, Western nations. It isn't a figment of the imagination that the West, with all of its might, its knowledge, and so on, is under a decline, morally, for a century now. More than a century. For 5 centuries. And we can see very, very clearly that the past few empires were all Western. The British Empire, before that the Dutch Empire, After that, the American empire. All Western empires. They have come to a close. And power is now being dissipated throughout the world because their strength is starting to decrease. We see that with the BRICS, all those big announcements, 59 countries joining. Just recently, Turkey announced, Malaysia announced, Indonesia, I think, Thailand announced, others have announced, okay? And also morally, everybody can see how, human rights, United Nation clause, it's all a farce. It's all useless. It doesn't mean anything. The moral high ground that the West had said that we've figured out the world has come to a close. Nobody believes that anymore. So the world is starting to say, okay, hold on. If Western standards that we've believed in for the past 100 years now don't make sense, then what does? Where's the answer? For the world, at every level, political, social, economic, people are looking for answers now. Personal, familial, right? And so you see that this is occurring. And you also see Eastern nations rejecting the idea of needing to be fully secular. You see that there's a turnaround coming, right? You see that people are like, well, hold on. If my values don't align with you, then I don't need to accept this. Like, look at the Qatar World Cup, right? You see how, with all the pressure, they still did not give in into the policies that were trying to be put on them. Okay. You see people waking up for Gaza and recognizing that their power is coming from something deeper. They realize that it's their Islam, because that's what they keep saying, that it's Alhamdulillah, La ilaha illallah. They are saying this is what gives us strength. This is what allows us to go on. So you see that this is occurring even though the East has clearly secularized for over 100 years. But yet, you couldn't change the people properly. Not the way the West wanted, at least. Right? You see that the industrial and military self-sufficiency is rising within the Muslim world right now. You see that people are saying, listen, I don't think we need to be dependent on international standards now. We can try to carve out a space for ourselves. And that is what we're trying to achieve at the moment, is to carve out your own space. Right? Because, it's nice to say that there's no riba, but if the entire system works on riba, how are you going to escape it? There's no real justice within the economic systems, let alone any other system. Right. Education, and this is the most fundamental thing, to be able to revive the Muslim Ummah, the educational methods and standards need to be changed. We need to de-secularize our education. It needs to be deeply imbued with understandings of Islam, with moral understanding, even in science, even in math, and especially within the social sciences. Those need to be re-engineered from bottom up. Right? These are the things that they really need to occur. If you can change the educational systems and their standards, you'll be making the biggest leap, because you'll be cultivating a new type of individual that is not secular, that does not see the world in this way. And that's where the change will come from. Because true grassroots changes is what are needed. Anyway, the Sheikh here, he has some advice to give to the Islamic leadership of the world. Right? And so the first one is the location of the Arabs. The Sheikh, and remember, the Sheikh is writing this when? Back in the 1970s. Okay? 1960s, 1970s. You wrote this very early on. Okay? Anyways, the Sheikh, he says, the Arab world occupies a very significant place in the world map. It has been the birthplace of people who have plunged an important and determining role in history. There's a lot of wealth and power in the Arab world. It is oil rich. It is the link between Europe and the Far East. Okay? It's at the center of it all. Okay? The Prophet ﷺ was from them, and he gave leadership to them. All right? The Arab world that used to be nothing only gained its significance through Islam. Without Islam, the Arab world has never had any significance. Think about it. Isn't it like mind-boggling that there has never been any significance to the backwater of Arabia before Islam. Even in Islam, its only importance was religious for most of its duration. And it's only in recent years that, ever since oil and the other things, that it's gained any relevance in the world. You know, there are still grandparents of Saudis who say that the Hujjaj from India, they would look at how much food they've brought and they'd give a good amount of it to the Saudis to survive. Because they didn't have food to eat. Right? Yeah, and it's a very, very recent phenomena to see the Arabian world being of any relevance, particularly the Jazeera itself, the Gulf itself. Right? So Allah Azza wa Jalla gave it izzah, gave it honor. Right? And it has a lot of potential in it. The other thing that's very unique about the Muslim world is that, you know, no matter how much you try to change the people, there's always so much potential of khair in them. It's like you just need to like snap your fingers, light a fire, and people will change. They'll come back. Unlike the West, these people have nothing anchoring them. They've lost who they are. Right? Within the Muslim world, they want to do the same thing by cultural colonialism, but it's really hard to do that. Because people still know their bearings. They know right from wrong. Okay, another advice that he gives to them is to have self-sufficiency in finance, commerce, and industry, and science. Right? He says that this is quite fundamental. Right? That if the Prophet ﷺ was the one who unified the people, and he brought them together upon Islam, upon Iman, and that's what gave them strength. Right? It cannot, the West cannot be its support anymore. You can't be relying on the West to keep you in check or to keep you in place. Right? You need to find your path towards God in your hearts and the souls, in the farmer's faith, to rekindle their Iman, so that people, when they do work, when they do strive, they strive towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So, you know, having different economies, not being extravagant, not buying non-essential things, right? Moving away from this so that everybody has a balanced life of zakah. There are many reports that say that if just the Arab world was to give zakah properly, then world hunger would come to an end if it was distributed correctly. Right? The world hunger would come to an end just by giving zakah. Right? So, and the other thing is, like, in terms of like expectancy, the world does expect that the Arabs take a lead role in Islamic leadership. But if they don't, then Allah Azza wa Jalla will give it to somebody else. Just like how Allah Azza wa Jalla has always done. Right? And so again, this is the advice that the Shaykh has to give, in short, to the Arabs, to say that they need to come back to Islam, just like how everybody else needs to come back to Islam, to be able to gain world leadership. Right? This, in a very, very brief and insufficient manner, is the gist of the book. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to benefit from this, allow us to continue to enlighten ourselves, our families, those around us, inshallah. Because look, a lot of these discussions, you know, they come up in talks, over dinners, over other things. And it's very easy to be like, oh, you know what? Yeah, you know, Islam's just like this. Or, you know, the Muslim world is just like that. But it's important to be able to strike a balanced understanding with people and give them hope. Allow them to understand that, you know, you play an active role in bringing things back to the way they're supposed to be. And this is why. Right? So, it's important to have at least a basic understanding so that you can have that type of conversation with the people, and as well as to have hope and vision. So if we don't have a vision, then what are we going to achieve? Right? If we don't have a vision, what are we going to achieve? So it's vision you need to have to move forward. I would still highly suggest you read the book, inshallah, to actually benefit from the content. بإذن الله تعالى. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون. سلام على المرسلين. الحمد لله رب العالمين. بارك الله فيكم. Yes, further questions, inshallah. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Sorry, I was not able to attend another session, so my question might have been addressed in the earlier sessions, but excuse me for that.
No worries.
My question is basically regarding one of the points you mentioned about separation of religion and state.
Okay.
So, at what point of time this was explicitly visible, like this? Because you mentioned about scholars and leaders, and in Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, if I'm right, uh, the leader was also a scholar, and I think that also hold good for the caliphate.
Yes.
So, when was it? There was a separate, or there was a segregation between a leader and a scholar.
Yeah. So we need to separate these two questions from one another, okay? Because secularism is the separation of religion from state. This did not happen. This did not happen. You had times of weakness and times of strength, but the fundamental understanding that religion is what state is. There is no such thing as an Islamic governance without religion. Right? The ruler is simply just a steward of God. Khalifa is literally just a steward who is there to take care of the affairs of God on earth, worldly and non-worldly, both. Okay. So secularism is a Western phenomena, which then was infiltrated through colonialism and other means into the Muslim world. Okay. Now that's a separate question. In terms of the question of when did the split of scholars from rulership, this happens immediately after the caliphate finishes, like with Ali radiallahu ta'ala an, and then Muawiyah radiallahu ta'ala an was the last proper scholar who was also a ruler. After that, you have Marwan, who was very knowledgeable, but he is reported at many instances doing whatever he wants. And you see, so the Sahaba were still alive at this time because Marwan was a tabi'i. So at times he tried to give the khutbah for Eid beforehand. At times he tried to sit and give the khutbah, and he was rebuked severely by the elder scholars and the elder companions because he was knowledgeable. And the Sahaba gave it to him. They were very severe against him when he would do certain things, something small that you might think, right, like the Caliph saying, "I'm going to give the khutbah of Eid before instead of after." The Sahaba rebuked him severely. On other such matters, they would do this. After that, khalas, knowledge started to become less and less and less within the rulers, and it became more about power and dynasty. So the moment dynasty, monarchy, became the predominant way of rulership, that's when you start to see this separation occurring. So it's very early on in Islam. But you still see that Sharia is what they know they need to rule by. They can't rule by anything else but Sharia. There's nothing else that they can't even think outside of this domain. Like, think of this. Can you think of an American president who does not believe in democracy? It's unheard of. That can't exist, right? Likewise, you can't think of an Islamic ruler that doesn't believe in Sharia. It just doesn't exist. Do you get what I'm saying? Yes, you might have a bad democratic president, just like how you might have a bad Shar'i ruler, but he's still within the domain of the Sharia. Do you guys follow what I'm trying to say? He can't publicly allow wine. That's not possible. He can't publicly allow zina. That's not possible. It's impossible. He can't do that. He can't overrule the Sharia. Does that make sense? Because the Sharia is what rules him. Just like how it's democracy is what rules the president, ideally, but that doesn't really happen, right? Just like how, in reality, a lot of rulers didn't really follow the best way, but that doesn't change that they still gave homage and they still tried to maintain the paradigm, the overall status quo. Does that make sense?
So, if they are following the Sharia, the understanding of Sharia, the leaders would fall on the scholars to understand it better and implement. Would that be a right statement?
Yes. So it was through the scholarly class that fatwa was given, and it was through the scholarly class that the qadis were chosen, right? And they were then also the ones who would give counsel to the leadership. But remember, they would do so only in affairs where they were invited to give, advice. As for politics, like warfare, expansion, they left those alone. They had separated themselves from the literal political body of the Islamic world, and that portion is what I'm talking about, that they separated from leadership. which was problematic.
But even the politics aspect of it has to be fall back on the Sharia, right? What does Sharia?
Yes, it does. So in terms of rules, it needs to fall back, right? But in terms of strategy, political, acumen, these things were separated. That's what. This is a fine distinction. It's not a secular distinction. It's a more finer distinction than that. Right?
Sorry for my fallback question on it.
No.
It's just so if I understand correctly from your brief discussion, it is 100 years, maximum 100 years of Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's demise. There was the leader and the scholar were the same. After 100 years, it was always separate.
Yeah, about
it was kind of getting diluted.
Yes.
Jazakallah khair.
وإياكم إن شاء الله. طيب, any more questions? All right. Barakallah fikum. It was an honor to do this class with you. It was the first time doing a book in this manner. I do apologize if there was any, a lack and insufficiency. But inshallah, may Allah make it that which was added to our Mizan al-Hasanat, inshallah. Barakallah fikum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.